On August 21st, Variety broke a big story about Disney desperately needing to regain young Gen Z men. They've hemorrhaged young men from Star Wars and Marvel and their other brands. But the big question is, why? And what can Disney do to bring us back? So let's look into it. I think the best way to begin is with a little story. One evening in 1934, Walt Disney got up on a recording stage in front of an assembled group of his animators. Over the course of about 4 hours, he went through the story of Snow White, the fairy tale princess who earns the hatred of her stepmother, the evil queen, and finds refuge with 7 dwarves who live in a forest. Disney acted out the tale with his trademark enthusiasm before delivering a final startling piece of news. Snow White and the 7 Dwarves would be a feature-length movie. This wouldn't just be the first for the studio, which had spent the past few years making a string of highly successful shorts. It would be the first animated feature in the world. Simply put, nothing like this had ever happened before. Nevertheless, the belief Walt Disney showed in his 1934 presentation proved to be infectious. The rest of the Hollywood film industry remained skeptical, and when word got out that Walt Disney was working on an animated feature-length movie, it was widely and smirkingly described as Disney's folly. He even said it was prophesied that nobody would sit through such a thing, but there was only one way we could do it successfully, and that was to plunge ahead and go for broke. Now, of course, we know that that Snow White feature-length experiment that Walt Disney did ended up being one of the biggest successes ever in movie history and has become one of the classics of any animated movie ever. So why is that such an important thing to start out with? Well, I think one of the big themes we're going to get into in this video, one of the top themes, is going to be leading with inspiration versus leading with principles. Leading out of that creative spark. See, there are so many things that make creators of all different types different and unique. Some, they create visual art, like animation. Some create stories. Animation is a fusion of both of those. Or others create music and on and on. But one of the things that unites a great creator is what they lead with, like where that energy comes from. And what I'm talking about here is how Walt Disney led with that inspiration. He went out there and did something, going for broke, like he said, that no one else had done before. As some of my future videos will go into, because I'm working on a big one about Jordan Peterson, I've got some very mixed feelings on Jordan Peterson. I used to be a huge fan. I know a lot of young men used to be, and a lot of young men still are. But one thing that he said in about 2015 was really spot on with what we're going to talk about today.
You can say exactly what Frozen is about. So it's propaganda. And the real artist doesn't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. They're exploring.
Now, despite what you might think about Frozen as a movie or as a story, still that point that he made remains, and that is that leading with inspiration versus leading with ideology, leading with principles, leading with what you think the message should be, what you think that people should take home. That's a huge difference from leading with that creative spark, from something deep within you that just makes you want to create something, want to create this new artistic piece. That is very different than wanting to be an advocate of something and try to advocate for some sort of policy. So I want you to remember that, because we're going to come back to it later. So with that being said, I want to talk about the big themes we're going to cover here. So the first one is what you lead with, whether you lead with inspiration or whether you lead with principles, and how that affects how your audience perceives you, whether that fractionates or brings people together. Okay? So that's going to be the inspiration, creativity. The other one is trust. Trust is a huge topic in general. I've covered in other videos, whether that be societal trust, like trusting someone random off the street or trusting your neighbor, or in this case, what I'm going to talk about more particularly though, is trusting in a creator, because there's that relationship that someone has. If they, I don't know, make a poem and they have a certain audience, right? If all of a sudden they expect a kind of Dr. Seuss level rhyme and then they subvert it and there's no rhymes, well, that's going to mess up some of the trust that's built up, because they trust that there's going to be the same type of thing happening. Now, that might work for them, but it might also not work, and we're going to cover that as well. But lastly, there's going to be another kind of background idea that I want to put out there to begin with, and that is this concept from the book Hitmakers by Derek Thompson. He talks about how the best creations are a fusion of the new and the old, and that's where trust and creativity come in. And when you lead with inspiration and you lead with that spark of something new and something that really to say, that fuses with the old, with the kind of same old that you expect. And if the audience gets enough of what they expect, that they feel comfortable sitting and watching the movie or clicking on it on Netflix, but then there's that new thing, that creative spark, that's where popularity and something really special happens. That's what he talks about in that book. There are a couple different, I think one of the ones he talks about is Maya, which is like most advanced yet acceptable. And that is this kind of like in-between point where creativity hits what you expect. And moreover, how that in particular applies to how Disney has lost young men, what they have done by leading with principles over creativity and by hurting that trust that has been built up in the past. We're going to have a little bit of a journey here, so kind of stay with me, because first we're going to talk about the idea of waves of art. So what do I mean by that? Well, in visual art per se, there have been different waves across history, right? You can look all the way back at like caveman times, and you can see that there was a certain type of style of caveman art, of course. But you can also see that in more modern times with things like romantic art and things like Victorian art. A great example, for instance, is Leonardo da Vinci. That is a very distinct style. He was trying very hard to recreate a very realistic version of what a human being looks like. And that's part of the reason why a lot of his works really hit deeply, because there's something so realistic and human about them that he captures super well. But then we get into later periods like Impressionism that really just is like a painting smattering that kind of gives you almost this surreal quality of looking at things and just kind of seeing what they envision, kind of what they stand for. And then of course we get in later and like more modern art, which is much more abstract. So what does this have to do with movies and film? Well, just like art had movements, so and waves, so did movies. Movies have had tons of waves. When you go back and you watch like the silent movies, you can see some really funny things. It's fascinating to go back and watch how people were like so engaged by this, because they would act out a scene and then all of a sudden they would have this slide basically where they would have white writing that would give whatever quote the person said before. And so you can see that across this, not only did technology, but also just the environment that these creators were in shaped a certain wave, a certain vibe with how things were approached. You have like the more classic movies, and then you get into more like the 1970s. The 1970s went from this kind of lighter. In the 1960s, you had things like Star Trek, and you had more optimistic views of the future, and more upbeat, kind of carefree, fun interpretations of things. And then you move on, and then in the 70s was much darker. You had things like Taxi Driver, for instance. You had people wanting to depict a more realistic version of life, a more gritty realism. And this is also true, particularly with things like superhero movies, with things like science fiction. Because we can see that all the way up into, in my opinion, the 90s and early 2000s were a distinct period. And a lot of people, this is not something new that I came up with, this is something that a lot of people talked about, how there's this distinct kind of campy, fun, this comfort with not being realistic in the 90s and 2000s with superhero movies. You had things like Daredevil and the Elektra movies. Even Tobey Maguire Spider-Man in a lot of ways were kind of campy. They were kind of fun. Now, there was definitely gritty realism more to the Spider-Man movies than, say, Fantastic Four. But still, those Spider-Man movies, in my view, fit squarely within that kind of 90s, early 2000s campy era. But then it's with 2008 and The Dark Knight that I think things really changed. That's when we move into a new era of superhero movies, a more gritty, realistic time, where we have, following that, we have the Daredevil series, which to me is like the apex of this gritty realism, where we're focusing very much on the street level characters, and we have to justify every little thing. Every leap has to be somewhat justified. There has to be some real earthly reason why this might be the case. And you can even see that in Marvel movies, which I think still in my view, fit really within this. It's not even probably until maybe we get into more of the Guardians of the Galaxy and kind of the more outlandish stuff that you can say kind of fits out of it. But even so, there's always this kind of wink and a nod. There's these quippy dialogue moments that say to the audience, hey, we know how stupid this is. We know how unrealistic this is. And that, to me, is almost saying to the audience, we know this isn't the era for this, but we're doing it anyways. It kind of gives an excuse for it on one level. But on another level, you can see with characters like Spider-Man or even the very early Marvel movies, there was still this real want to try to ground things in more of a grittiness and realism. So that to me is kind of how you can see a lot of these things have affected back and forth. But then we get past that to kind of the 2010s, and you can see this market change. So then the question is, what changed in the 2010s? Now I'm going to get more into the precise things that changed, but in a bigger way, the things that changed was the orientation to creativity. Imagine, for instance, instead of approaching the Batman movies with a innate interest in making more gritty and realistic, like Christopher Nolan had to say, instead he said, well, in my view, I think, and imagine the British accent. I can't do a very good British accent, but imagine his British accent saying, well, in my view, what we really should be doing is talking more about how, rich people can make a big difference in the world, and we have to show how rich people can make a big difference. And that's what he was talking about. That was the whole point of the movie. And he starts out, before even creating the movie, and during the process of creating the movie, as he's filming, he's constantly talking about, well, really the point of it is how important the message, and this message is rich people can really make a big difference. And now imagine more than that afterwards, that all of the actors were saying the same thing. Yeah, the point is we got to make sure that rich people can make a big difference. And now imagine more than that now a bunch of other people who are making movies at the same time are saying the same thing. They lead with, instead of their big creative vision, they lead with, well, I really think that rich people should have more credit, and they really can make a difference in the world. And that just was across the board. Well, you might think to yourself, this doesn't seem like creativity anymore. This seems like a message. This seems like advocacy. This seems like they're trying to change what people perceive, what the audience thinks through their movies. And in a lot of ways, I think that's how my generation feels, or at least a lot of young men feel when they view these movies. They don't view it like, oh, well, they're just trying to create one more great piece of art, like Taxi Driver, for instance. I know I'm picking on that movie a lot, but a lot of the great movies of the 70s, they're just trying to create one more great piece of cinema. Instead, if they're constantly leading with that, they're going to think that they have some great ideology about how rich people are underserved and how rich people have to have the spotlight more. And now let's just change that to be a different group. And I think we understand what I'm talking about, because it doesn't seem like it's coming from a creative place. It seems like it's coming from a principled place first. So now the question becomes, what more specifically were they advocating for, or what more specifically is the problem here? Well, let me go on a tangent and tell a quick story. So right after Thanksgiving a year ago, a bunch of my friends wanted to do a Friendsgiving. So they invited a bunch of the friends over, some people I hardly knew at all. And there was this acquaintance there who basically looked like a stereotype of what you'd expect like a social justice warrior at 23 would look like. She was very sweet. She had a good attitude. I didn't have any issue with her at the time, so I didn't really think anything of her. But we were having some conversation, and I made an offhand joke about the difference between men and women, because I work mainly around women in my current job in healthcare. So I just was making some joke about that. Most people laughed; they thought it was funny, but she seemed to have like this weird frown on her face after I told the joke, and she waits until everyone is done, and there's this awkward silence for just a moment, and she looks at me and says, "Well, that's just a generality." And of course, I don't know what you say to that, because of course it is generality. That was the point of the joke. So that's what I came back with, and we just kind of awkwardly moved on from that. But that is a great representation. That's a great example of what I think the issue was. And that is that rather than making this like hyper political, going into ideologies and feminism and social justice and all that stuff, instead there's actually a very kind of broad way to think about it in my view. And that is, in the 90s, early 2000s, there was this idea that I think a lot of people were trying to move toward, that a lot of filmmakers and popular culture were trying to move toward, and that is, some people can be X. Right? So a lot of times, you'll have your ensemble movie. I think the Avengers is a great example. They have their ensemble movie, and there's one girl on it, right? And so the idea is, and this was true, you can go back into a lot of the early 2000s movies, there was usually like one girl on the team, or there was like one black person on the team, and the concept was some people can be whatever that thing is. Some women can be spies. Some women can be Avengers, right? That's the general concept. But around that mid-2010s time, there seemed to be a shift in that thinking, and that is, instead of some people can be X, it's a lot of people are X. So a lot of women are spies. Okay, and we'll go into that more. But first, let me take a step back and talk about the problem with the some people can be. The problem that a lot of people critiqued was tokenism. They were like, well, you're not really giving any screen time, so the representation is very shallow. It's not anything deeper. You're just having a black person on the team to have a black person on the team. It's nothing bigger than that, nothing deeper than that. However, there's two ways to take this. One way is to make a lot of the team black, or to make a lot of the team women. Okay, that's one way, and we'll talk about that way in a second. But another way that they could have done was instead of trying to change that kind of outward composition, they could have tried to give the spotlight more to those characters. So you could still have your leads be relatively the same, whether that be, whether you're watching a movie that stars a white guy, or whether you're watching a movie that stars a white woman. You could still have that kind of composition be roughly the same in whatever those movies are, because you're appealing to the same demographic. We're not talking about like a BET movie. We're not talking about an Oprah Network movie, but we're talking about like just a mainstream movie that has had a bunch of entries in the past, like The Avengers or something else. Instead, you could then take, okay, well, why don't we give Falcon more screen time as a supporting character and try to build him out more, understand who he is. He can still be Captain America's movie, but we still kind of build him out as a character. And that's one way you could have addressed that problem with tokenism. Another way, though, is instead to do what I think they did, and that is they looked at the some people can be, and instead said a lot of people are. So why is that interesting? Well, when you apply that, you see that over and over again. It's like this aversion to stereotyping. It's not just an aversion, because we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's not just an aversion. It's like wanting to go to the opposite. So instead of some women can be fighters. Think, for instance, Brienne of Tarth in Game of Thrones. She's a really tall woman. She was very unique. A lot of people made fun of her for that uniqueness. That's one way. But another way to think about it is the Black Widow movie. In the Black Widow movie, on the other hand, almost all the women were fighters. Now, I get they're spies, but that is the kind of mentality that I think happened a lot. And you see this over and over again. You see a woman on screen, and she's like, well, I'll prove it to you. I can fight people just as well, even though she's like a foot taller than the men that she's doing. And even though sometimes you watch the stunts, and there's like stunt men to the side that are just waiting for her to punch them. And they're just kind of like waiting around just to be punched in the face. So despite that, they kind of clung to this idea that a lot of people are. And when you take that just as a mentality, you don't even have to go deeper and go more political, although you could, but you don't have to. But when you see that pattern, it applies a lot across the board. And this, to me, is one of the reasons why the mid-2010s in particular, because I think that's when this mentality of a lot of people was at its height. And when it was at its height, you saw this inversion of what I was talking about the creative process. Instead of the Walt Disney fire in his belly to make something new and original and cool and unique, instead of that, you see the opposite. You see that principles come first. That the principle of inclusion, in this case, a lot of people of trying to bring all these different people in, even when it doesn't matter, or even when it's kind of inconsequential, or when it doesn't fit, or it doesn't matter, because that's what came first. What came first was this mentality. And when they were promoting movies, you saw over and over again, how many times, oh, well, this is important because this group doesn't get enough credit, or this is important because of this, and that word importance is the dead giveaway.
What does it mean to be a woman in film?
It means it's really hard. And if you're a woman of color, then it's really, really hard.
Other people besides white dudes like Star Wars and would love the opportunity to do a set visit. And I'm also saying I don't hate white dudes. I'm just saying we need to be conscious of our bias and do our part to make sure that everyone is in the room.
When you hear over and over again, this is important, what's going on really when an audience member hears that? Well, they hear, I need to like this even if I don't. I need to think this is good. I need to support this even if I don't. And that change, that kind of push, not to watch something because you genuinely like it, but to watch it because it has some deeper, more principled motive, that is a big shift. And that's why, to me, it doesn't quite represent, it's not quite like the waves of the past. It's something very unique altogether. Because and that's part of the reason why you see a lot of these reactionaries online, these people who've gone, in my opinion, off the deep end with their critiques of these movies. Because to them, it has turned into propaganda. And now I don't think I would go that far to say it's full-on propaganda, but in some cases it probably is. In some cases I do think it is, because it reminds me of some of the Christian things that I grew up with, where basically they're preaching right at you. They look at the screen, and they're really just telling you how you should think and how you should feel. But that doesn't represent to me all of the Hollywood movies. Instead, I think that is the general direction, though. That this leading with message, this leading with principles, and when that is led with, and creativity takes a back seat, it hurts the creative process. It hurts that relationship that you have with your audience. Now, it's not that minorities being the focus is innately bad. It's that the message, the principles, led first. So you can easily think of a lot of examples. You can think of, for instance, like a young gay filmmaker who looks out at the rom-coms and is like, well, there aren't any that represent the gay people, so I should create one. And he creates one, and you can see in his eyes that he has like this great interest, this great passion to make a great product, to make a great movie. And he looks at all the music, and he looks at all the actors, and makes sure all the casting's right, and all the appearance and the aesthetic is correct, and all the dialogue is accurate to whatever setting he's doing. And whenever you talk to him and he's interviewed, he talks out of the passion of the movie. And you could easily imagine that being a really popular movie. And it's not going to get nearly as much of the hate as if he did the opposite. As if instead of him caring about the actual inspiration of the movie, the art itself, all of the different facets of that art, the direction and the camera angles, and like I said, the dialogue and the script and all of these different facets, instead of him focusing on that, and when he's interviewed talking about that, instead he leads with, well, gay people don't have enough rom-coms, so I gotta create one, and this is a really important film that all gay people should watch, and everyone who's an ally should watch it, because it's important and it's worthwhile. And what we talk about is really important for young people to look at and for young people to look up to, because I try to put someone really aspirational as the main figure. Do you see how that hits differently? Because it's not about the art, it's about the message. It's not about the creativity, it's about the meaning, it's about the principles. And that's the huge difference in the mid-2010s that to me alienated a lot of people. And in a lot of cases, it's also women too, because who really wants to sit down and turn off their brain to listen to someone preach at them? That's not really what a lot of people, even a lot of feminists, really do. They want to sit down and watch something entertaining. And if along the ride they get some of that, fine. But to lead with that, these people a lot of times want to. And the particular example about gay rom-coms, I think, is a good one, because there's a reason why Heartstopper on Netflix has like 3 seasons and is going to have a movie, and yet Bros, on the other hand, was a crash and fail. This movie, supposedly this groundbreaking rom-com about 2 gay men, was a total fail and a total dud. There's a reason why that both of those are different, and that's because one was very much focused on the inspiration, the creativity, about the cuteness, about all of those innate factors. Even if straight people didn't watch it, or straight men didn't watch it, or young men didn't watch it, it didn't matter, because they weren't actively really hating it. They didn't really register. Why? Because they weren't preaching about how groundbreaking it was, about how important it was to watch it, like was some of the rhetoric around Bros. And I think that's a really great case study for what I'm talking about. But to lead into my next point, this would also be true if it was on the right wing, if the right wing was doing that. And a great example is the Daily Wire. The Daily Wire signed Gina Carano after she had her scandal about, I think, comparing the vaccine mandate or something to Jews. And whether you agree, disagree, or it doesn't matter. She probably shouldn't have been fired, because when you compare it, it's not like there was that big of a difference between what a lot of other people said, and it's probably up to her to have her own personal opinion, even if she's stupid for whatever opinion she has. Regardless, though, she was signed by the Daily Wire, and the Daily Wire made a big deal about having all these different movies with her. Well, in so doing, did you hear much more about any more movies with her? No, not particularly. And even so, more than just that, they made a big deal about how they were going to open up and make a bunch of kids' content. Well, if leading with a message was so important, or was so valuable, right, then they would have been very successful. Then it really would have worked for them. But what happened? Actually, the exact opposite. They ended up having to lay off a bunch of that entire department. Their CEO stepped down, because the truth is, no one wants someone to lead with ideology. No one wants someone to lead with their message. They want to lead with the creativity first. When you lead with that message, whether that be right-wing or left-wing, then people just shut off their brains. They don't really want to be preached at. This isn't the realm of punditry. This isn't the realm of politics. Now, political messages can absolutely work in movies, but when you lead with that, when that becomes the focus first and foremost over the story, over the art, over the plot, that's when things really get messed up. But I don't think the Daily Wire is as bad as Disney or has alienated as many people. Why? Because Disney has a much larger reach. And if now Daily Wire had the same reach, that might have been true for them. But Disney has a much broader reach. And so I think that has made the division even starker, even broader than would have been the case had they just did something on a small scale. So when Disney did this, what you have to understand is that there's going to be a consequence for every action that you do. And if you decide that you want to center minorities in what have been something catered to specifically young men, in a lot of cases young white men, then what do we think is going to happen? Especially when it's not something that's organic, that comes from the plot itself, or that seems like it doesn't have some greater ideology or greater reason in mind, and you're not leading with that. What's going to happen? Well, those people are going to start thinking that something is up. They're going to start thinking that something's off, something doesn't feel right, and that's what happened. Even if it doesn't make people do a big backlash, then what is going to happen? Well, a lot of times they're just probably going to lose interest. They're just going to tune it out. They're going to watch something else. And so I think a lot of that interest has gone to video games and anime, because a lot of those have led first with the inspiration and allowed the message to take a backseat. And so that's where that audience has gone. Now, the people who didn't just lose interest, though, those people who really, in a lot of cases, care deeply about whatever that thing might be. They might have grown up with Star Wars. They might have grown up with Marvel. And when they see trying to put principles and message over the deeper inspiration, and when over and over again it seems to have this underlying feel of like, oh, well, women have to come first, or minorities have to come first, when you don't feel like you've necessarily done anything, or you've just been watching something, you're like, why do I deserve to be preached at? I've just been watching whatever thing I like. And so when that happens, and you really care about that, there are a lot of people who would, understandably, even if they've gone too far, or even if they've said things that have been whatever, beyond the pale, it's very understandable for there to be a market backlash. And that's what's happened a lot. There's been an entire ecosphere now popping up, partly because the Disney has incited it. Now, I'm not saying that the backlash is worth it, that some of the people have done the right thing, but the first action was done by Disney, by leading first with that message. And that's created a certain amount of people who, no matter what Disney does, will make it very difficult for them to ever care, ever really like it. They have to hit a 10 out of 10 in order for them to be okay. And that was something that was created by them, because they didn't think of what the consequence of leading with message over inspiration would be.
And in your opinion, how is this a feminist film?
Well, feminism is just about equality. So I think this film is incredibly diverse, it's intersectional, and it's about overcoming suppression.
See, had it not been principles over inspiration, but rather the reverse, creativity first, and then minorities had been more centered, I don't think we would have had nearly the same issue. Here's why. You can already see this somewhat happening in comics. Some of the comics, for instance, Miles Morales, that came about much more organically. Even if, like, maybe in the back of his mind, he wanted to have another black superhero, still, in his own right, he's become a very popular superhero because he's interesting in his own right. You don't tune in to one of the Spider-Verse movies thinking to yourself, oh, well, I really think it's important that I watch a black man as the center. You're not thinking that. You're thinking, I really like these movies. They're really interesting. That's your first thought. Your first thought is, I like the creativity, I like the art, I like that first. And that's because when you lead with that, even if you are still centering those minority characters, it's not as big of a deal. But another great example is a very recent one, K-pop Demon Hunters, which both centers minority as far as race goes, at least in America and the Western world, and that is Koreans, but also is a very feminine movie. It leans into that femininity and embraces it in not a way, though, that is focusing on message. It doesn't have a bunch of people going around on interviews saying, well, it's really important that men aren't the star. It's really important that there aren't a lot of male characters and that male characters aren't that strong. It's really important that the men are the bad guys, or it's really important that the women finally have a chance to shine. You don't see a lot of that when you're watching it. Instead, you just see that there's this kind of fun-loving embrace of femininity and an enjoyment of the creativity, this kind of new animation and fusion between the more Western animation and the more Western style, and coming from a Western studio that is Sony, and a more Asian, Korean influence from K-pop, which actually has a lot of crossover with the younger generation. So it hits right in this sweet spot. But what you notice, again, is that the message came second. The message came second, and the inspiration came first. And so the reason why I want to put that in here is that I think it's really important that the point of what I'm saying doesn't get lost. The point is not, oh, well, minorities got the spotlight, so now young men don't care. That's not the problem. The problem is why they got the spotlight. They didn't get the spotlight because a director of Captain Marvel thought that they had a very unique story to tell. Instead, they wanted to have the first female-led superhero movie for the Marvel Universe. That's what they wanted. And notice how different the outcome of that becomes. Furthermore, though, because a lot of this ended up being women taking men's roles, or women taking what were traditionally men's roles and doing it with that message first, there became this friction that particularly young men faced. And now it is much more mainstream to talk about how young men are faltering and how they need help and how they're falling behind and things like that. But at the time, that wasn't the case. However, those same young men were still faltering. They were still struggling back at that time. And so put yourself in the place of a lot of us young men at the time. If that is true today, like I said, if it might be mainstream today that young men are struggling, then it was also true for the same young men 10 years ago. It was also true in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. And during that time, what are they hearing? They're hearing that they're sexist and that their heroes need to be replaced by women. And even if you might think that is not fair characterization, still that's how a lot of young men perceived it. And if that's how they perceived it, specifically while they're faltering, that makes it all the more difficult to hear. That makes it all the more ripe ground for a big backlash, to be upset. And here's the other big thing. This is a little bit of a side point, but I think it's important to say to kind of understand where things are going. And that is, a lot of the reason that many of these female creators or more feminist-minded creators were making things and trying to center women at the forefront was because they believed in sexism, and they believed that women had not had their place of representation in the past, and they really deserve that going forward. But think about that for a second. It wasn't the 15-year-old young men who created sexism and who have been the architects of misogyny. They were not upholding the system. They've only been alive for 15 years. Right? They're hardly even graduating high school in 2015, right? Most of Gen Z were still in high school at the time. So what have they really contributed to misogyny? Not much, really. So what in effect was done was that the heroes of Gen Z were replaced by women for feminist reasons, right? But the reasoning was because boomer men had acted sexist. So because the system, right, that had been made, that had been upheld, was negative, was wrong, therefore the heroes, the entertainment, that young men who haven't really done anything, who've just been basically living, right, who've just been at school, the very oldest of Gen Z in 2015 would have been 20 years old. And so at that exact time, they hadn't contributed to that negative system. That was the reason why their heroes were being replaced, or that the movies that they liked, action movies in particular, and science fiction movies in particular, they weren't the reason why those people should get representation. It was, in effect, boomer men, because they were the ones, in a lot of cases, who created this studio, or have been running that studio, or have been running this system, or been running government, right, for a long time. It was a completely different generation. So in a lot of ways, it looks like the generation that is hurting and having a difficult time, it then doesn't get the heroes that it likes. Then, because of things that another generation has done, doesn't get the representation that they would appreciate. And I think that in particular has really hit home, even subconsciously, for a lot of young men, because we hear that, oh, well, this is so sexist, or that is so racist. And when you've only been alive for 19 years, what stake of that racist system have you created? What stake of that negative system have you actually made? You've basically been a passenger in your life up until 18 years old? And so you haven't really made a lot of decisions. And so here you are getting the negative consequences of something that you didn't even do. And because of that, I think that really has made the gap even larger. And that's something that I think in particular, a lot of the people who might support Disney or watch these things don't understand, has created a lot of resentment against young Gen Z men. All right, so now let's pause this topic, this discourse, and go and kind of pivot onto something else, and that is the idea of trust. Trust is a really big concept. Like I talked about a bit earlier when I was kind of introducing this video, it's a really big concept. It can refer to trust in between two people. It can refer to trust between big groups. But in this case, I'm talking about the trust that you build as a creator with your audience. That trust. And more importantly, the kind of expectation that your audience has of you. If you go to watch your favorite YouTuber, you have a certain idea as to what they're going to create. If all of a sudden you watched a video essayist like me, and I came out and I started rapping, you would be like, what? Well, what's going on? Because that goes against totally what you're expecting to happen. And the same thing is true for large brands like Disney. Actually, all the more true, because they've created this brand, this trust, over a large amount of time. Now, why is this important? Well, I think kind of similar to McDonald's. If McDonald's had... Well, let me take a step back, actually. I think part of the reason why something like McDonald's is a great example, a great analogy with this, is that just like Disney, it might even be at a kind of similar time, actually, a little bit later, but kind of similar, it's created this brand across time that whether you're in the Midwest or whether you're on the East Coast or you're in California, or wherever you are, you're like, okay, if there's McDonald's, I know I'll probably like it, or I know what I'm going to get. And because of that, they have a certain trust buildup of the expectations, and so does Disney. But if all of a sudden a McDonald's burger was tasted like Chipotle, then you'd start to think, what's going on? Or if all of a sudden it was a bunch of Chinese food, you wouldn't understand it. They would lose a lot of business because they violated that trust. So just like I talked about earlier, the fusion of that consistency and expectation along with the creativity, that fusion is what makes this explosion of popularity and greatness. And that's part of the reason why something like, in my opinion, K-pop Demon Hunters became so successful, is because it was this kind of in-between. It was almost like a Disney musical, but it integrated a lot of K-pop elements. So it really created this kind of new convergence you wouldn't expect. So because of that, we can apply that to how we think about Disney. When you look at what Disney has created over the past probably 10 to 20 years, it really has changed a great deal. The consistency in what is to be expected has changed. Now, when I talk about trust, I'm not exactly talking about trust that the movie is going to be good or of high quality. I'm talking about, and I think a great example of this would be Age of Ultron, because it got to, I think, $2 billion, but no one's going to think that it makes like top 200 even best films of all time. Probably not even the top 500, right? It's not a particularly great movie, and yet it was super big because the idea of trust isn't exactly like trust that it's going to be great. It's a very similar type of trust to what used to be the case for movie stars. Movie stars used to be a huge draw because they had a certain brand around them that kind of movie was going to have a certain type of feel, a vibe, an aesthetic, a combination of factors that made you know and identify by watching it that it was going to be that kind of movie. Harrison Ford is a good example. You can go back as far as like Cary Grant and movies like that, because there was a certain type of movie that star embodied and that you knew you would get when you watched it. However, as time has gone on, the value, the power of a star has waned. There are a lot of really good YouTube videos kind of explaining this, but the value of a star like Tom Cruise has really gone down over time. And instead, IP, intellectual properties, has gone in its place. And in its place are things that Marvel, DC, Disney in particular own. Now, that's what we're talking about here, and that's how, in my opinion, things have really morphed for Disney, have really changed, have in some ways twisted. And that's because, like I talked about with Age of Ultron, there's a certain expectation you have with a Marvel movie. There's a certain thing that you want. And like I said, when you hit that in between of creativity and expectation, you really hit the gold mine. The problem is, what if you don't have creativity and you also don't have consistency? And I think that's what's happened a lot. They miss creativity and consistency. I think a great example, for instance, is Star Wars The Last Jedi. I'm going to get on that, kind of harp on that movie a little more later. But because I think it's a great example how Disney faltered. Even if you like that movie, the stereotypes, the vibe, the expectations you have, the tropes of a lot of those types of movies were missing from that. Here's why. One great example is it's a Star Wars movie, and yet in that movie, I don't think that there was a true lightsaber clash, lightsaber. And if it was very brief. There wasn't a real Jedi or Sith actually ever fighting each other in that movie. I think at one point, Luke fought with a stick, and then another point, the big fight of it is they fight with a bunch of guards. And so even just on something as simple as that, a Star Wars fan, when watching a main movie, is going to expect a lightsaber fight. And that, by the way, that was one of the biggest critiques that a lot of fans had of Rogue One, was that it didn't have any lightsaber fights. Again, this is not about like a high quality movie. This is about a certain expectation that you have in a given genre. That you watch a horror movie, for instance, and you're going to expect something scary. If you watch a horror movie and there's nothing scary, you're going to be like, why am I watching this? And it's the same thing that Marvel did in a lot of cases. They took something that had a built-in fan base, and they lost the consistency. So while instead of inspiration, they had messages, and then instead of consistency, they had inconsistency. I'm not just talking about how they were producing things, right? Because this is also true when it comes to Disney Plus, because they had an expectation, that their fans had an expectation that this is a movie franchise. This is a movie franchise, and all of a sudden it's TV. So that already kind of changes it, right? But I think a lot of people got over that. But then once things became significantly inconsistent on the television screen as well, and you had things like Ant-Man and the Wasp, that was considered a big failure. Once you have a bunch of those, then the fans start to think, okay, well, I don't know what I'm going to get when I go to watch a Marvel movie. I don't know what I'm going to get when I watch a Star Wars movie. And if you're not going to trust in the creativity, then you have to put some faith in the consistency. And that wasn't there either. It's important to say that this is about vibes, not facts. Keep in mind, this is about like the marketing, the brand of Disney. And so when we think about this, even if in the comments, for instance, if this gets any amount of views, and you say, oh, well, here's one example of how they did this right. Here's one example of how this is incorrect. Remember, this is creating almost like a picture for people. This is creating a picture for your audience. If one time you create something, do an experiment, and your audience doesn't like it, well, it's not the end of the world. You have an entire database of work you can draw on to compare and say, okay, well, that's not quite me. That doesn't stand for me. That was just an experiment that I tried. But the more that you do it, the more that you change, the more this becomes a fact and reality, the more that vibe, that impression is something that sinks in with your audience. So let's talk about, for instance, what vibes are we really speaking about? Why is this important when it comes to trust? Well, that is, different genres, different types of movies and works have different tropes, okay? They have different cliches, different stereotypes surrounding them. The people almost tune in for those things. They tune in, for instance, to a horror movie because they want to be scared. They don't tune in because they necessarily love the intricate dialogue, right? They tune in for certain elements of that create this kind of this ecosphere, this picture of vibes. And in particular, the issues that Disney has had is around very male-dominated genres like science fiction and action movies. For instance, like superhero movies is a great example, right? So the question is, why is there this kind of fear, this hesitance by Disney to lean into those stereotypes, but instead to lean away from them? Why is it hard, it seems like, for it to kind of look and appear like the tropes of old, right? Like the genres of old, lean into that. But instead, there seems to be almost like this narrative of we have to make it appear different, right? We have to make sure it's a full female cast, and we have to make the colors a little bit different, and we make this a little different, instead of allowing the core of it to be something unique. There's a lot of good examples of what I'm talking about, but I think a good one off the top of my head is Stranger Things. Stranger Things has several very popular gay characters, and yet totally leaned into the 1980s element. It didn't go on a big press tour saying, oh, look at our gay characters. We're doing something important. We're doing something meaningful. Look at us. But instead, leaned into its 80s vibe and allowed the characters to be themselves. Allowed the inspiration to come from within the product, from within the core of that thing, instead of it being on the outward appearance, which is a huge contrast between how, for instance, Marvel treated Captain Marvel, where so much about it was, oh, look at her, she's a female fighter pilot. And again, it's like changing the surface level vibes, like the things that might make you feel like it's an action movie, which in this case would be a male star, right? And changing that, and yet the actual substance of it isn't particularly different, right? It's not particularly groundbreaking or even progressive, right? It's just one more action hero winning in the day. It doesn't have some big twist. It doesn't have something very unique. Instead, it puts all that stuff at the surface level and makes that surface level the real twist. And this shallow surface level twist, I think, is part of the reason why, as a side note, even some progressive people aren't particularly interested in Disney, aren't particularly interested in the products that they dish out. Why? Because the real progressiveness, the real step forward, is the more Stranger Things method, is having is having a genre that you lean into, this 1980s theme, really leaning into it, leaning into the feel of it, leaning into the tropes of it, and not being afraid of those stereotypes. And yet, as you go along, the real progressiveness is that they had these gay characters that were interesting, that you felt for, that had real character to them, and weren't just, hey, look, I'm gay and that's my only shtick, or hey, look, I'm a woman and I'm doing something that not a lot of women do. Look at me. And instead, it's something deeper than that. I think even a lot of people who might be on the left just kind of lose interest with Disney because it makes it look like what they're offering, even when they say they're being progressive and doing something important, isn't anything really transformative, isn't anything really deep or changing, but instead is just, once again, that shallow surface level change. And that's where I think a lot of the ambient animosity comes from, because it would be almost like a bunch of anime creators that a lot of people loved, or that owned a lot of property that a lot of young men loved. Instead, we're fundamentally changing the surface level thing so it didn't feel like the thing you liked anymore. It didn't have that vibe anymore. That consistency of the aesthetic, of that feel of watching whatever property you like is gone. And yet beneath that shallow first layer is nothing real. Is all insubstantial. It's not something you can actually latch onto. Unlike, like I said, Stranger Things, or another great example is Knives Out, where it took so many of the tropes of a mystery, and yet at its core was something very unique, and a very unique message, a very personal message, even somewhat progressive as well, but yet leaned into that genre. And there seems like Disney almost has this aversion to leaning into the genres it has, to leaning into the vibes that it has. And more than this, it almost feels like there is a certain discomfort with their own properties, a certain disinterest in their own properties. What do I mean by that? Because if you are not working to actually capitalize on the feel, the aesthetic, the vibe of the things that you have, the genres that you have, and how they look and how they appear, and you're kind of like, you're ashamed of the generalities, you're ashamed of like some of the old elements. If that's how you're dealing with it, and that also comes up with the people that you hire, not necessarily knowing a lot about Star Wars, not necessarily knowing a lot about Marvel, or having a lot of interest in Marvel, or are new in general. Well, what happens? Well, then your fans themselves start to get the feel that you don't really like the things that they like. You don't appreciate the things that they appreciate. And that to me is one of the biggest first steps that Disney could do. It's hire and appreciate their own properties. It's find people who genuinely like the things that they have, like the fans do. And to not be afraid of leaning into however those things feel, however they look and appear. Not being afraid to have big, boisterous lightsaber fights, or to center young men as the stars, but to lean into these things, and then as they go on, allow the inspiration to come out later in the actual story themselves, in the actual plot themselves, and to not be afraid of their own properties, but to hire people who genuinely care and love them as the fans do. And even if they don't, then to start paying attention to, what do our fans actually love about these things? And even as a step further than this, what you have to realize is who your fan base is. Your fan base for a science fiction movie or for an action movie is going to be lots of men. And you have to realize that, okay, well, if I'm making this, I should not be ashamed. I should not have a problem with appealing to whatever that genre stereotype might be, because this is what our fans like. If you're making a rom-com and all of a sudden there's no love in it, or that people don't profess love to each other, or there aren't beautiful love ballads, then what are you saying to your fans? You're saying that I don't really appreciate that rom-com genre. And that's what I think a lot of us have felt. They don't really appreciate what the fans appreciate. They don't have the same appreciation that we understand. And so that to me is the first step. The first step is you have to lean into your properties, lean into your fan base, understand what they like, and make that the forefront of what you do. Understand who the people are who are going to watch the science fiction movies 10 times. Don't optimize for the people. Don't optimize for the girlfriend who's going to come with their boyfriend once. Optimize for the guy who's going to come 10 times or 5 times to the movie theater because he loves that thing so much. That is your audience. That's your main people. You should not be embarrassed that is your fan base, but rather embrace them for the people that they are and for what they appreciate about things. That's a big reason why, for instance, Dave Filoni has a lot of online fans, because you can see in how he talks about Star Wars that he really appreciates Star Wars, that he is a fan himself in a lot of the same ways that we are fans of Star Wars. And that's what Disney needs to look for. Not optimize for the people that aren't fans, but optimize for the people who are. So, to sum up everything, in my opinion, the biggest reason why Disney has lost us as young men and has lost Gen Z in a lot of ways is very simple, actually. It's because rather than leading with that creative spark, like the story about Walt Disney, instead they led with message. They led with ideas and principles over that creative inspiration. But second, the consistency that we have grown to expect and that their fans grow to expect has largely been lost, or at least really hurt in a lot of ways, because they've had this aversion to stereotypes, tropes, to cliches. And in a lot of ways, those tropes make up what a genre is, what a horror movie is, are the same story beats, that same aesthetic and feel, the jump scares, the loud noises, right? That's a big part of what a horror movie is, and in a lot of ways, there seems to be this aversion Marvel has to leaning in, or I should say Disney, in my opinion, Disney has with leaning into those genres, with leaning into those tropes, but instead tries to lean away and make the surface level seem different and nothing underlying. So instead of being a Knives Out, which leans into the mystery and a lot of those same tropes of a mystery genre, but then underneath that, is something unique and different and inspirational and creative and something cool. But instead, it's the surface level that's different. It's that, oh, it's so important that we have a female lead, but yet the story itself isn't particularly good, isn't particularly worthwhile, isn't particularly new or creative. So they've lost that consistency and have instead not shown that they really care about their fans and what their fans want, what their fans appreciate, and instead care about their own message and their own meaning and their own principles. And if that changes, then I think Disney can really right the ship. But it goes first to showing the fans, to showing the true fans, the fans that will come and see it 10 times, that really buy your merch, that want to pass it on to the next generation. Show them that you understand how they care, what they care about, and leaning into those things, and allowing the inspiration to come from within the project, not from without of it. So that's my long-winded take on what Disney can do to right its ship and how it's been faltering so far. So thanks for looking into it, and I'll see you in the next one.